On Thursday, U.S. President Donald Trump abruptly announced he was ending trade talks with Canada. He said it was because of an advertisement running in the U.S., produced by the Ontario government.
When someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time.
The 60-second TV spot has been running since October 15th. It uses footage from nearly 40 years ago, a former U.S. President, Ronald Reagan, speaking against American protectionism.
High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs.
After the president criticized the ad, Ford pulled it off the air, but only after it ran during the World Series, which a lot of Americans watched. Trump has since said he would boost punitive tariffs on Canadian imports by another 10%.
Whether it's provincial or Canada itself, they all knew exactly what the ad was. The Prime Minister knew, everybody knew. The Prime Minister knew what the ad was before it went.
At the same time, Carney is turning his attention towards working things out with another superpower, China. Today, the Globe's chief political writer, Campbell Clark, is here. He'll walk us through why the ad struck such a nerve, how the breakdown of talks will impact Team Canada, and what Carney and Trump are both up to in Asia in the meantime. I'm Cheryl Sutherland, and this is The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Hi, Campbell. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And today we're talking about the trade war and Trump. And with anything on this file, things can change fast. So just want to say that we're talking Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. So, Campbell, this is not the first time Trump has called off negotiations with Canada. But how big of a deal is it this time around?
Well, it's a big deal, at least right now, because it means that everything's stopped. There are still tariffs on Canadian goods. There's a larger review of the USMCA or CUSMA, whichever one you want to call it, trade agreement that keeps most of our goods tariff-free. That's coming up supposedly in early 2026, and that's a high-stakes thing as well. So, yeah, it's a big deal. As long as it lasts.
Yeah, USMCA or CUSMA is our agreement between Canada, US, and Mexico, which protects a lot of the, our products are actually protected because of that deal. But Trump has also threatened to up tariffs on Canadian goods by 10%. Do we know when this might happen?
No, we don't know when it might happen yet. We have not seen the executive order, which is sort of the technical order that, or the official order that puts those tariffs in place. And in fact, if you've heard Donald Trump or his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, over the last couple of days, they've kind of dodged the question when they've been asked. Interesting.
Yes. Let's talk about why this is actually happening right now. Trump says this is happening because of this anti-tariff ad released by the Ontario government and Ontario Premier Doug Ford. For those who haven't seen this ad, could you just describe it?
Yeah, it's not a very, complex ad. It is Ronald Reagan giving a speech in the 1980s. It was one of his radio addresses, and he's talking about, how tariffs are a bad thing for the economy in the United States and the economy in the world. And it's supposed to be a reminder to Americans of the sort of long-term damage and the fact that a Republican icon believed that there was long-term damage to the tariffs.
Some of the imagery as well is you see a lot of Canadian and American flags, a lot of families, workers, kind of giving a sense to an American audience that this is kind of a real bond here. That's kind of what I got from watching this ad.
And by the way, that is the way Ronald Reagan thought of that free trade agreement back in the 1980s as a real bond of nations, neighbors making a building together, So that part is certainly true.
Yeah. So Trump called this ad, quote, a fraud and said it was misleading. Was it?
No, not really. I mean, there was a section because this was an address that Ronald Reagan gave at a time of trade disputes with Japan.
As perhaps you've heard, last week I placed new duties on some Japanese products in response to Japan's inability to enforce their trade agreement with us on electronic devices called semiconductors.
He was talking about trade actions with Japan, but was saying in the end, we do not want to have tariffs between our countries, right? And, it's kind of funny that in this day and age, Canadians are trying to convince Americans, Republicans, that Ronald Reagan was against tariffs. He was a free trade warrior. That's what he was known for. He was known for that in Canada. He was known for that in the United States. But Ronald Reagan was an anti-tariff president. There's no doubt about that.
Right. So we kind of think that Trump ended talks with Canada because of this ad. But why was he so upset about this ad?
So first of all, I do think that Donald Trump was, getting piqued with Doug Ford. And we'd heard that before, right? Like there had been a point in time back in the spring when Doug Ford threatened to cut off electricity in the United States and Donald Trump threatened a doubling of steel tariffs. And then Ford backed off. And, the U.S. ambassador has been suggesting that, Donald Trump was pretty unhappy with Doug Ford. So this is not entirely new. And if there's one thing that, American politicians don't like, it's somebody running ads on TV against them. And Republicans do still see Ronald Reagan as one of their few modern icons. And it is probably something that annoys Republicans, or, it does play at his Republican base.
Something that's interesting is that this ad has been running since October 15th. And last week, Trump basically said it was fair game.
And I even see foreign countries now that we are doing very well with taking ads. Don't go with tariffs. They're taking ads. I saw an ad last night from Canada. If I was Canada, I'd take that same ad also.
But now Trump's ending trade talks over this ad. So what do you make of this shift?
Well, I think it was probably different once it was running and people were seeing it. And it is quite possible that as it sort of got under the skin of Republicans, it got more under the skin of Donald Trump. It's also pretty likely that he was looking for a way of cutting things off or demanding new concessions from the Canadian government, which was asking for a few more details and guarantees before finally closing down this sort of smaller sectoral agreement on steel, aluminum, and energy. And, again, this is the Donald Trump modus operandi. He's been using something like this to get Canada to make concessions before a deal is even done. The digital services tax that Canada was about to apply on the United States, he insisted that Canada stop that before the United States go back to the negotiating table. So it's a way for him to demand concessions without giving anything in return.
Interesting. Let's talk about Ontario Premier Doug Ford. What has he said about the president's response to this ad?
Well, it's interesting because Doug Ford has politically, in a way, far more than Mark Carney, used Donald Trump as the foil for his politics. And standing up to Donald Trump was the sort of key issue, if we can call it that, in the Ontario provincial election in the spring. His reaction to Donald Trump has been, well, we've got to fight.
They need the manufacturing might of Ontario. We know that. So I wouldn't ever negotiate through weakness. I'd negotiate through strength. That's what President Trump respects. He's seen the whole world roll over. I'll tell you, I'm not going to roll over.
I think he bragged about the number of impressions or the number of people that had seen this ad.
Billion times, I think, was the number.
A billion impressions, I think. I have no way of knowing if that's the truth, to be honest. But, it had an impact. And I think he seems pretty proud of that. Whether or not he's getting any heat for having sort of triggered another set of tariffs, maybe. He seems to not believe, Doug Ford says that he doesn't believe that there will actually be another 10% tariffs on Canadian goods because of it.
Ford says his concerns are for Ontario's auto sector, which is being impacted by this U.S. trade war.
Let's talk about a so-called imminent deal. I've been hearing this for month after month after month. And if there was no mention about auto.
How does this ad help Ontario if trade talks are now off because of it?
So that's, the catch-22 of dealing with Donald Trump, right? He's going to hurt you, and maybe he'll hurt you less if you fight back, or maybe he'll hurt you more. And that is the negotiating situation that Donald Trump is always trying to set up, right? I'm going to cut off talks if you dare say a word against me. I'm going to cut off talks if you don't remove some of your retaliation. I'm going to, so this is, one of the tactics that Donald Trump uses, and he is the powerful president of the United States and has the kind of leverage that nobody else in the world has. But, Doug Ford is right that the auto sector is in trouble. It is one sector that is where Canadian and U.S. industry are deeply intertwined. And, you could argue that Donald Trump's tariffs on Canadian automotive products are hurting U.S. industry as well. And I think that's one of the things that the Ford government is trying to get across in the United States. And also, I think Doug Ford politically feels like he has to do something to say and to look like he's trying to fight for those jobs because they're leaving now, right? We've seen Stellantis and General Motors cancel shifts and close plants in Canada. And that kind of move, a few more of those will be sort of an existential threat to the auto industry in Canada and in Ontario. And he probably didn't know that an ad like this would cause Donald Trump to cut things off, but he probably felt he couldn't afford to do nothing, and he couldn't afford to be seen to be doing nothing.
Mm-hmm. And interestingly, also, other premiers have kind of come out in support of this ad, like Premier Wap Kinew from Manitoba, Premier David Eby from BC. They see it as like a good tactic, I guess.
Yeah, David Eby even said yesterday that, he would use all of the tools at his disposal, including advertising, to fight softwood lumber tariffs from the United States. It's worth pointing out, though, that the overall trade negotiations aren't being managed by the premiers, and it's Mark Carney that has to try to thread this needle at the end. And he is the one that has to have the sort of direct relationship. So it's a bit trickier for the Prime Minister of Canada than it is for the premiers who, they will get demands to fight for their industries and their economic interests in their provinces. So it's not always easy to sort of balance the interests of one industry in one province against the other.
How has Prime Minister Mark Carney responded to the breakdown in negotiations? Does he blame Ford?
So no, he hasn't blamed Ford. He's been pretty low-key. In fact, he kind of hasn't blamed anybody, right? He sort of stood stoically and said, we were making progress and we'll stand ready to continue the talks when the Americans are ready to continue the talks. If you're the Prime Minister of Canada, you're going to have to balance the sort of different competing political pressures that you face. One is Canadians really do want to see somebody stand up and fight Donald Trump because they don't like the giving into the bully thing. And, a lot of Canadians, some Canadians complain that Mark Carney promised to be elbows up and he hasn't been. But the other pressure, of course, is if you can get a deal with the United States that alleviates the trade pressures on Canadian companies and helps save Canadian jobs, well, that's something Canadians want as well. And, he is under pressure to save Canadian jobs, to avoid a recession, to avoid the fallout that one way or the other will be damaging to Canadians and probably to his political interests. So he's got two very difficult competing political interests to deal with there.
We'll be right back. So, Campbell, these new trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada are happening as both Carney and Trump are on parallel Asia trade trips. And this trip marks the first time in years that we'll see a Canadian Prime Minister meet with President Xi. What's the significance of that? And do we know what could come out of it?
So the meeting between Mr. Carney and Mr. Xi, which is supposed to happen later this week, is supposed to symbolize a reset in relations between Canada and China, which have been fairly well frozen since 2018 when the Canadian government arrested Meng Wanzhou, who was a Huawei executive, the daughter of the founder of Huawei. China retaliated by arresting two Canadians, the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and there was a series of trade barriers sprung up, and things have been very frosty ever since. So there hasn't been an official meeting between a Canadian Prime Minister and President Xi since that time, although there have been sort of pull-asides at summits. But it is a big deal because, of course, if Canada is facing difficult trade relations with its biggest trading partner, the United States, and as Mark Carney has said quite extensively, he's looking to diversify trade, and the second biggest economy in the world is China's. Trade with China is already pretty large for Canada, but it's pretty unstable. It's pretty unpredictable, as we've seen with canola, right? As we've seen with Canadian meat. And sometimes that's because Canada has its own tariffs against China, like the ones on electric vehicles. But
yeah. So the tariffs you're talking about here, the tariff that Canada has on Chinese EVs, 100%,
yeah.
And then China has retaliated with 100% tariffs on Canada's canola.
Yes, but sometimes it's just because of, politics, because of difficulties in relationships. So I think the thing that Mark Carney will be trying to speak to the president about is, we want a stable trading relationship with China. We want to be able to establish some sort of rules of the road and expectations so that Canada's trade is not used as a weapon against Canada every time there's a disagreement between the two countries.
Mm-hmm. So Trump is also set to iron out a potential trade framework between their two countries. Do we have a sense of how that could impact Canada?
Yeah, I think so. That's the big deal in the world, right? That's the one that is very important to global trade all around, really, and to people who are concerned about the growth of the global economy. And it does have an impact on Canada, right? Canada needs to have a diversification of its trade, but China needs that less if the United States trade is open. An example of that, just a small example of that, is that Canada has difficulty because of the trade barriers on its canola. Well, the United States has had the same issue with soybeans, one that's really hurt American farmers. The Chinese are buying soybeans from Brazil. Well, both of those things are, canola and soybeans are sort of crops that substitute one for another to a certain extent, where they're used for cooking oil, for feed. And once China settles its trade disputes with the United States, well, maybe it has more alternatives to Canadian canola. Now, that's not necessarily the biggest deal in the world, but the point is that, the more the big agreement between China and the United States is worked out, the less both of those countries need to work out their other trading arrangements. Canada doesn't have a huge amount of leverage with China, but China does want and has tried to appear to other countries to be kind of a more stable alternative, or an alternative to U.S. trade, right? Because countries around the world, not just Canada, are facing tariffs from the United States. They're facing disruptions in their trade relations with the United States. And China's trying to sell itself as a trading alternative.
Interestingly, we know that, China is also not a very reliable trading partner. We had a whole episode about canola showing that this is not the case when it comes to China and Canadian relations.
Yeah, well, we're in the world of big superpowers that are able to use their trading power as a weapon. The phrase that foreign policy experts use is weaponized interdependence. So if you count on your trade with a foreign country, they can use that against you. And in Canada's case, that's definitely true with the United States, and it's somewhat true with China. And, the argument I think that you'll see Mark Carney, or at least we will, I don't know if we'll ever see it because we probably won't see those private talks between Mark Carney and Xi Jinping, but Mark Carney's goal there has to be stable trade with China. We need some form of stability in the Chinese relationship. It's not that there isn't a big Chinese market for Canadian goods and that there cannot be trade between the two, but the Canadian interest is in seeing that stabilize because our U.S. trade is now extremely unpredictable.
So it does seem like Carney is stuck between these two superpowers. How does he navigate this?
There's a couple of things that are difficult, right? One is that the United States want to keep China out of some of their markets. And there's a distrust about countries that deal with China. For example, there's a concern that Canadian trade with China could increase sort of backdoor shipments of products from China through Canada to the United States. And that gets the Americans putting up trade barriers. Another is if we open our car markets to Chinese companies, that makes them sort of less valuable in our trade talks over the auto sector between Canada and the United States. If we have more and more integration and more economic trade with China, we still have to be concerned about them using it capriciously and weaponizing it against us when there's a political arrangement. And that leads to the sort of last thing, which is Mark Carney's political consideration here at home, where, Canadians don't trust the government of China as a reliable partner. They don't think that China has a good human rights record. They are concerned about China making threats or trying to push its own sort of rules of the world on Canada. So that's a very tricky thing for Mark Carney to negotiate, leaving one superpower that we've known to work with a superpower that we're wary of. That doesn't make things very, very easy.
Yeah. This is a very big trip for Carney, and it comes after months of him speaking about the importance of diversifying our trade efforts and highlighting Asia as part of this. What will be signs to you, Campbell, that this trip is a success?
Well, for one thing, it's hard to imagine that there will really be any of the fruits of that success that are immediately visible, like the real fruits of that success. Years ago, there used to be these Team Canada trips that Jean Chrétien used to go on, and they'd sign a bunch of deals, but all those deals were completed before the Prime Minister ever got there, right? And there will be some of that this time, but this is for Mark Carney kind of the Asian version of the European trips he did earlier in his premiership, and he did a lot of European trips, where he has gone not just to sort of diversify trade, but to seek investment. You know, he met with the CEO of a Malaysian gas company, Petronas, which invested in LNG Canada. He's looking for investments from major Asian companies. When he's in Korea for the APEC summit later this week, he's going to go visit the Hanwha shipyards where they build submarines. And Canada is looking at buying submarines either from Germany or from South Korea. And one of the aspects of the negotiations is, are you going to arrange to invest in Canada as part of this deal, to build things or buy things from Canada when we buy submarines from you? And possibly, you know, can we have a closer security alliance where we have exchanges in security relations? So these things are, you know, these could be very sizable things for the Canadian government. Nothing like replacing U.S. trade, but if you're trying to attract investment and trade, those are some of the places to start. I think that the main point of this Asian swing is opening up investment from Asian countries into Canada and sort of creating sort of partnerships, because those countries need to diversify their trade and investment relationships as well.
Just lastly here, Campbell, and coming back to the Canada-U.S. trade relationship, how long do we think, I mean, obviously we don't know for sure, but how long do we think this latest pause on negotiations could last?
My opinion is it's not going to last very long, but there will be things like this with Donald Trump until Donald Trump is no longer president. He's shown that every single time with pretty much every country in the world. If we do sign a deal, there will be something else that he wants to renegotiate soon afterwards. It happens every time. And he has the power to sort of disavow his own trade agreements now, which he did with the USMCA. So I think this pause will probably not last more than weeks, but the next pause will be coming soon after.
So expect a lot of stops and starts as we go ahead into the future.
On whatever agreement we're negotiating at the time.
Campbell, great to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it for today. I'm Cheryl Sutherland. Our producers are Madeline White,
Campbell Clark,
Michal Stein, and Chief Political Writer. David Crosby edits the show. Adrian Chung is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.